Greetings from Cooperstown, New York, home of the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum, and also headquarters for our latest virtual program. We're very glad to be with you today, Virtual Voices of the Game. My name is Bruce Marcuson. I work for the Education Department, and it'll be my real pleasure to talk to the Hall of Fame's newest president, Josh Rawitch. He officially began September the 9th of this year, so just a few months into this exciting new job here in Cooperstown, home of baseball, and of course, home of the Baseball Hall of Fame since 1939. Before we talk more about Josh, give you some insights into his background, his past work, and he's done a lot of great things. We do want to initially acknowledge our primary sponsor. We cannot do these programs without the generous support of the Ford Motor Company. They have been our sponsor throughout 2021. So we thank Ford Motor for being a generous supporter of our virtual programs here in Cooperstown. Again, our guest is Josh Rawitch. And before we bring Josh into the program officially, I want to give you a little bit of background. He's had a long career in baseball, has worked in the game for 27 years. Joined the staff of the Dodgers back in 1995, coincidentally or not. That was the year that I started here at the Hall of Fame. Worked in marketing and PR for 15 years. Then worked for a short time as a beat writer for MLB Advanced Media. Then went back to the Dodgers for a number of years. Eventually joined up with the Arizona Diamondbacks organization, eventually becoming their senior vice president. Along the way, he has received really the most prestigious award that anybody in public relations and media information can win. That is the Bob Fishel Award, and that is one of many topics we'll talk about with Josh today. Josh, we welcome you to the airwaves, Virtual Voices of the Game. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Bruce. Thank you. Excited to talk and hopefully hear some questions, and welcome everybody virtually into Cooperstown.
So it was on September 9th of this year, just a few months ago, that Josh officially became the 8th president in the history of the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. He was certainly on site for several months before that, learning from Jeff Idelson, observing this year's induction ceremony, and fully preparing for the job. Josh, I'd like to begin by going back to your beginnings, growing up Southern California. You liked the Los Angeles Dodgers, not surprising given your location. And you told me that this was your favorite player growing up, Steve Sax, who was a terrific second baseman for the Yankees, for the Dodgers. Why Steve Sax? Why was he your favorite?
You know, it's funny. I when you mentioned that you were going to kind of kick this off with that, I honestly hadn't never thought before why I liked him, but I think it honestly came down to, for anybody that remembers him, he would sprint to first base after he drew a walk, which is honestly the only person I can ever remember in the 45 years I've been alive and watching baseball who actually sprinted to first after a walk. Everybody else drops the bat and leisurely goes, and he just, for whatever reason, I think that resonated with me. He wasn't necessarily the star of his team. He was kind of more the hard worker, get after it sort of guy. And so that's kind of how I modeled my career after that approach. I think in Little League, I was sprinting to first on walks. I wore number 3. It's pretty crazy, but that's, I think, probably how it happened.
Well, he was a very good player, always hustled, always gave you a good effort, hit for average. Was a pretty good defensive second baseman, did have problems for a little bit with throwing to first base, but he eventually overcame that. And he had a couple of good years with the Yankees. I, of course, have been in the Northeast for pretty much my whole life, so I followed him real close when he was playing second base for the Yankees. What's really cool here, though, is you got to know him very well a few years ago because he joined the staff of the Diamondbacks. He became one of their coaches.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. In fact, I had met him a couple times at the Dodgers, not particularly well. I do remember as an intern, my boss kind of embarrassing me when I first met him and said, "Hey, Steve, this is Josh. He wanted to be you when he was growing up," and then made me go tour him around the ballpark. So I had met him a couple times, and we had actually been connected on LinkedIn of all random places. And at one point, he reached out to me in the offseason and said, "Hey, I'm thinking about getting back into coaching. Can you connect me with Kirk Gibson?" And I just remember thinking, that's insane that my childhood hero is asking me to connect him with another childhood hero at the Dodgers, who's now the manager. So yeah, he wound up only coaching for us for a very short amount of time. But what Gibby really wanted out of him was to teach his guys how to steal bases, how to hustle. Kind of, he really felt like that's what Steve knew well. And there were just any number of times during that year when he was a coach of the D-backs that there were times I just look around and like, this is so strange. I'm sitting next to him on the plane on a flight somewhere, and I just kind of have a flashback to what my 6 or 7 year old self would have thought if I could ever tell that kid that this would be my job and this would be who I'd spending time with. A lot of those pinch me moments since joining the Hall of Fame, but that was one of them at the Diamondbacks.
So did you tell him that he was one of your favorites?
I think he knew. I think we had connected a couple times over the years where he probably knew. Thankfully, he never made me feel that foolish about it. But, even the thing I've learned over the years in dealing with so many players is that they also had favorite players, and they know what it's like to hang out with their favorite player. So I don't think he ever wanted to make me feel self-conscious about it. He was awesome and just a great dude, really, really great guy, and still hosts radio on Sirius XM. And so we'll stay in touch from time to time on text, and really happy to see his success.
Now, have you had a chance to be on his show yet?
I haven't. No, I've done Sirius XM before, but I have not yet been interviewed by Steve Sex. That would certainly be a full circle moment if that ever happened.
Yeah. Well, let's see if we can get that to happen. I think that'd be very appropriate. I enjoy listening to him. I just recently got MLB Network Radio when we bought a new car just a few months ago. And he's been one of the programs that we've been listening to, or I've been listening to pretty regularly. So I do enjoy his work for Sirius XM. Let's talk about joining the Dodgers in 1995. And we are going to talk about this great photo, you and Joe Torre. But you're a novice at the time. You're just really entering the real world, I guess. Your first baseball job, your first job with the Dodgers. What were your duties? What did you have to do starting in 1995?
So I was very lucky. I landed an internship after my freshman year of college. I had a professor who said, "Hey, don't be afraid to send your resume to your hometown team. You never know what'll happen." And I really didn't even have a resume at that point. I had to put something together, but I sent it off and I landed. The department was called Advertising and Special Events. It was basically marketing before they really called it a marketing department. And so I was doing everything from helping put together the scripts that you would read that you would hear over the PA when you would hear the PA announcer announce what's going on between innings. I would help write that. I would help put on Think Blue Week, which was essentially live out your Dodger dreams. I'd help read the letters and judge them. And then, as you can imagine, plenty of grunt work over the years. I was told at a very early age, actually right before that internship, my father had said, just do the things that nobody wants to do and come back with a smile on your face. And so that's really what I did. A lot of things nobody else wanted to do. And I would just show up and say, what else can I do? And they would just keep giving me more and more.
Josh, were you mostly in the office or did you get to spend some time on the field too?
No, it was pretty much all office work. Every once in a while as an intern, you would get to go down. And I remember the first player I ever interacted with was Chipper Jones. He was, I think, a rookie, ultimately went on to a Hall of Fame career. But I just very rarely would I get to go down on the field for anything. Because the marketing department really didn't have much interaction with the on-field side of things. And ultimately, that's probably what made me want to switch to PR when I went full-time. Was I kind of had this feeling that if I was going to work in baseball, I really wanted to work with baseball. If I was just going to kind of be upstairs, you don't really feel like you're connected to what's going on. And so I wound up making the shift over to PR, essentially just because it was more involved in everything. It was partially the business side. It was partially the baseball side, kind of straddles them both. And that's how I ended up shifting over to the communications side of things.
Do you remember the first Dodger player you met?
Well, I do. As a kid, I remember I would, just like everybody, go wait and try to get autographs. So there were plenty of guys over the years who signed an autograph for me. But I do remember when I was an intern, we actually had to move the World Series trophies from 81 and 88 from one place of the building to another, which is kind of ridiculous. They had the interns doing that. By the time I got to the Diamondbacks, it was security and people who actually knew what they were doing. But I do remember Don Newcomb being there that day, and I got a chance to shake Nuke's hand with these massive hands and really learn who he was. I kind of had some sense, but as I got to know him over the years and hear about his role in the civil rights movement and these meals he would have with Martin Luther King and Jackie Robinson and Roy Campanella. It just kind of blew my mind that this guy was still around and hanging in the offices. And I have a cool photo of us from that very first year.
Well, that was a great first encounter. I mean, a guy who had been a standout in the Negro Leagues, great pitcher for the Dodgers, had some phenomenal seasons, great postseason performances with Brooklyn, and then really did noble work for much of his post-playing career. He had his own struggles with alcoholism, and he would do a lot of outreach. He would talk to kids. He would try to work with people who were struggling with alcoholism. I mean, that was a pretty big time first encounter, I'd say.
Yeah, and he also, it's funny, yesterday we just announced that Jack Graney had won the Ford Frick Award. He was the first player really to become a broadcaster. Don Newcomb was among the first who really kind of helped start the community affairs department at the Dodgers. Nowadays, that's just commonplace that every baseball team has a community affairs department and players work within it. But Nuke was one of the people that really helped, along with several others, Sweet Lou Johnson, among others, that just really got into doing community work at the team level, and an amazing man.
Now, something I found interesting, and I had not known about this until doing some research the last couple of weeks, but you actually left the Dodgers for a little while. You became a reporter at MLB.com. I think one year you covered the Dodgers, another year you covered the Giants. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it was for those that are kind of regular visitors to MLB.com or any of the team sites, back in really 2000, all 30 teams had their own websites. They looked very different, and they were run and owned and operated by the teams. And then in 2001, as MLB tried to figure out kind of what the internet was going to be, they really wanted to make sure that a team like the Yankees or the Dodgers couldn't go out and make crazy amounts of money, more than the Expos or the Marlins. And so they basically took over all the 30 teams' rights and created this company, MLB Advanced Media. And they asked two people from every team to be a part of the start of MLB.com or MLB Advanced Media. One person was going to be the technology side, and one person was going to be the content person. So I was, at the time, 24 years old, and they asked if I wanted to be a content person. And I thought, yeah, it sounds like a great opportunity. It was a step up from what I was doing. And about a week after we got the job, they put us on a call and said, all right, you guys are all beat writers now. You're covering your teams. You're going to go be reporters. And I thought, I don't know a lot about that. I grew up in a journalism household, but I had certainly never really done that for a living. But I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I loved the creative writing part of it. I loved the chance of kind of traveling on the road with the team. That was my first real taste of, not with the team, but going on road trips and getting to write about the players and the team. And then ultimately what I think it did is it helped me understand how the flow of a day works for the media, how it works for the public relations department, how it all comes together. And so it was a really, really valuable couple of years. I did get a chance to cover the Giants, as you mentioned, in 2002. They went to the World Series. I got to cover Barry Bonds and Jeff Kent and be a part of just all the things in baseball in 2002 that were really pretty special. So brief stint, but I learned a ton from it.
I remember growing up thinking, I want to be a beat writer. It sounded so glamorous. And then as I got older, I realized this is really hard. I mean, you're traveling all the time. You got to be at the ballpark early. I mean, your season starts in spring training. You go all the way through to October. You're constantly on the road. And when I realized I had a fear of flying, I said, I don't think this is going to work for me. It's not an easy job.
No, and it's I don't know that people kind of recognize just what a difficult, challenging job it is. There's stress. There's the pressure of feeling like you've got to beat the other reporters around you for news. There is a lot of standing around. Ultimately, that was one of the things that kind of drove me from it, is that you may want to interview somebody who's not available. He's got BP, he's got a hitters meeting, and then he's got treatment in the training room. And you'd find yourself, okay, if I'm writing a story today about Reggie Sanders and Reggie's not, you could spend 2 hours basically standing there waiting for the guy, and then eventually get your 6 minutes with him. And it is, I have a ton of respect for people who can survive a 162 game season as a beat writer in baseball. Anything in baseball is an incredible job. We are all very lucky to be working in it. But it's definitely not as glamorous as it may look.
So then you go back to the Dodgers, a more conventional position. Is that when you really started to go into public relations?
Yeah, I came back in 2003 as the assistant PR director, so essentially the kind of number two person in charge of that department. And it really allowed me to get involved in kind of everything that goes on, from setting up interviews with players to writing our game notes and putting together our publications and advising executives on what might be coming in a media interview, that sort of thing. That all kind of started from 2003 through the next 8-9 years of my career.
Yeah. Josh, who do you report to? Who was the head of PR at the time?
My boss, well, it's funny, we had a ton of turnover in those days. This was right around the Frank and Jimmy McCourt years where we were constantly turning people over. So I'd probably say that the person responsible for bringing me over from marketing to PR really was Derek Hall, who was essentially the assistant PR director at the Dodgers when I met him as a mid-20-something, and now he's the president of the Diamondbacks, and he's really the reason I wound up there. But there was another gentleman, John Olguin, who was a great mentor of mine, who rehired me the second time around as kind of his right-hand person.
One of your managers with the Dodgers a little bit later on would be Hall of Famer Joe Torre, seen in this great image that you sent me. First off, before we talk about Joe, let's talk about this photo. What's the context? Where was this taken?
So this is actually on the Great Wall of China. Back in 2008, we had the great fortune to be the first major league teams, the Dodgers and the Padres, to play a game on mainland China. And so we went during spring training, and it's funny, Joe actually just flew back with us from the winter meetings 3 days ago, and we were talking about this trip specifically, but we got to play in the stadium that was going to be part of the Beijing Olympics. It was basically, we were going to be the trial run for that stadium. And we had one free kind of morning/afternoon where those of us who wanted to go to the Great Wall got a chance to take a quick trip over there. And so it was Joe, it was Kim Ang, who's now the Marlins general manager. Matt Kemp, I remember walking around. He was kind of still a pretty relatively young guy in the league. And we all just got a chance to wander through Beijing. It was pretty awesome.
Having never been there, I don't know that much about the logistics of the Great Wall, but there seems to be an area behind you guys, kind of a ramp that's a little bit on an incline. It looks like anybody can walk there. How much of the wall are you able to walk?
You can go quite a bit. And there's certainly the area, I think, where the parking is, where there's just more people in the very close vicinity that's essentially the most touristy area and that has probably the best views. I think that's probably why they set it up that way. Just like anything, unfortunately, it's become a business at this point, I'm sure. But yeah, it's funny. It was rather large. I do remember spending a couple hours wandering around. Ton of players, ton of executives. I think there's a group shot of us somewhere with maybe 30, 40 people. In fact, actually, I don't know if this photo, I don't think you can see him in there, but Jaime Jarrín was there, another member of our committee this past weekend, the Dodger broadcaster. He was right there behind us, I think, in this photo. And really pretty. I absolutely love international travel. It's one of my huge passions. So to get to go do that and several other countries with baseball teams has been a pretty cool honor.
Let's talk about Joe Torre. He's become one of my favorites. I've had a chance now, the last year and a half that we've been doing these Zoom virtual programs. We've had a chance to interview him 3 times. Most recently, he was gracious enough to talk about September 11th. He actually did that during his visit to Cooperstown for the induction ceremony. He's terrific with us. Tell us about working with someone like Joe Torre on a day-to-day basis.
Well, what's funny is I grew up going to Joe Torre baseball camp. When he was an Angels broadcaster, I was at his camp. So I can remember him giving me drills on what to do as a catcher. And then to think that whatever that would be 20 years later, we're standing at the Great Wall, and 30 years later, we're sitting on the stage of Derek Jeter's induction is kind of silly to even imagine. But he is every bit as amazing as you kind of envision him being when you see him as the public figure. He has this way about him that makes everybody feel very, very important, from the young clubhouse kid who might be a teenager and he's cleaning shoes, to the CEO in the boardroom, to another Hall of Famer, to a restaurant, someone working in a restaurant taking his order. He's just very thoughtful person, I can just remember a number of examples where you can tell he thinks about things very differently. And I just feel very lucky that I got the chance to work with him for 3 years, because he really was. At one point I said to him, actually, it's pretty funny, no joke, he called while we were sitting just now, like about 10 minutes ago, my phone rang and I blew him off. So I apologize if Joe is watching this, he'll know why. But, at one point I remember him, it was just something he did for someone that nobody was ever going to know. And that's the sort of person he is. He's always doing nice things for people, treats them well, and doesn't expect anything in return. He's really just a special person.
I think it's important to point out, and you probably know this as well as anyone who's worked PR. Some managers, can be difficult, very demanding with the PR office. Something gets out, there might be that tendency to blame someone in public relations, even if it's not their fault. So to have somebody like a Tory really has to make your job a joy.
Oh, I mean, you just nailed it. There were so many instances where he just got what we needed to do. He understood if this was an interview that was going to be kind of shared in one way, I remember walking to an interview one time and he said, well, so Tony, I shouldn't say your name in the response, right? Because if this is going to get used somewhere else, he thinks about things on a different level. And I think at one point I remember saying to him, we were at dinner one night and I said, do you realize you've probably done more media interviews than anybody in America over the last 15 years? You think of a president of the country doesn't speak down. He was going twice a day in the biggest cities, New York and Los Angeles, every day, and never really screwed up. He never misspoke. He just had a way of making our jobs very, very simple.
Well, when you can go through a long tenure with the New York Yankees, working for the boss, George Steinbrenner, and pretty much avoid controversy, you've accomplished something remarkable.
Yeah, and win 4 championships. Don't forget that too.
That's right. Yeah. One of the guys that I understand you became real close to, Clayton Kershaw. Now, this is a more recent photograph. I think you were working for the Diamondbacks at the time, but with the Dodgers, you got to know Kershaw. What do you like about him?
Man, this photo is actually from Sydney, Australia. It was right after shortly after I'd left the Dodgers to go to the Diamondbacks, and I think in 2014 we opened up in Sydney, and so I think that's why I'm in the red and he's in blue. But you could just tell when he was drafted at 18 years old that he had the personality and the humility that he was going to go a long way. You just could tell that he was a great person. Obviously, I had no way of knowing he was going to be one of the best pitchers, not the best pitcher of his generation, but we were very, very lucky that back in 2008, there was a film that was done called Bluetopia that was basically kind of behind the scenes of the Dodgers season. And it actually happened to be there the day of his major league debut. So there's all sorts of great footage from his debut that you would never have. And he's just a great person. He gives, similar to Joe, gives a lot of money to charities and looks out for people, takes people under his wing. But I do remember, it's kind of funny. I just saw this photo and something triggered. Shortly after I took the job at the Diamondbacks, the Dodgers and Diamondbacks got into a fight. I had not yet left the Dodgers, so I was still working for them, but everybody knew that I was going to be leaving at the end of the year to go to the Diamondbacks. And so there's a brawl. Kershaw throws at Gerardo Parra, and part of our job is to go downstairs into the clubhouse and talk to the players about kind of what's likely coming with the media. So I come downstairs, and Kershaw and Mattingly are sitting on a couch in the clubhouse, and Kershaw says, "Tell your boy Parra." And I said, "My boy? I've never even met him before. I'm still with the Dodgers." And he said, "Well, whatever. You're going over to those guys." And I remember Mattingly said, "If we got into a fight right now, whose side would you be on, ours or theirs?" And I was like, "I'm still with the Dodgers." Yeah. And 2 weeks later, I was gone and moving to Arizona.
Was Kershaw the kind of a guy that you could go to? Reporters are looking for somebody to talk to. It's a tough loss. Maybe he didn't pitch that well. Is Kershaw the guy that he's still going to show up, do the interview? Could you always count on him?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. Now, I have a caveat. I left in 2011, so I was really only there for his first 3 years. He was good, but he was not yet at this point where he was the best pitcher in baseball. But everything I witnessed myself was that he's always the stand-up guy waiting to answer the questions. He's not. It reminds me a lot of Paul Goldschmidt, who just doesn't like to put the attention on himself. And so he very much, he's never going to be the guy popping off or flaunting or anything like that. But yes, when he struggles, he's going to stand there and be the stand-up person that he's supposed to be.
Yeah. Of course, he's a free agent now. There is a possibility that he'll move on. Is that difficult for you to imagine Clayton Kershaw wearing anything but a Dodger uniform?
I mean, yes, of course. I think anytime you imagine Freddie Freeman or any of these other guys that have spent a whole career somewhere, it is hard to imagine. But it's also, I think all of us have just kind of become accustomed to the way the game operates. And actually, I remember, he grew up in Dallas. He's a suburb of Dallas, and he's a big Cowboys fan. And right before the Cowboys opened up their Jerry World, their new stadium, I remember we were playing the Rangers and I was there, and he asked, it was still basically under construction. And Clayton had asked if I could get us a tour, and we all got a chance to go over there while it was still being built, and they showed us around, and he was flinging a football around on the field. Actually, something most people probably don't realize is he and Matt Stafford were little league or Pee Wee football teammates. Kershaw, I think he was the center and Stafford was the quarterback, or vice versa. So you talk about some pretty impressive. Now they're both running the show in Los Angeles, but he was a big football fan, and I thought that was cool that we got to see the Cowboy Stadium before it opened up, and he was like a little kid. He was just like any other little kid who got that cool, unique experience.
One last point on Clayton Kershaw. When you watch games on television, you don't always get the sense for how tall, how big some of these guys are. And then you see a photograph like this. I mean, Clayton Kershaw is massive.
And I'm not that tall. I'm only 5'9", so that's part of it. But yes, he's bigger than most. Certainly, I think most pitchers. That's why it's hard when you see someone like it's so impressive. Someone like a Marcus Stroman or someone who's my height, 5'9", 5'10", and pitching in the big leagues. Most, particularly pitchers, most of these guys are well over 6 foot. I want to say Clayton's like 6'3", and pretty broad shoulders and unbelievable arm.
Yeah, he's not this skinny kid, which is what I remember him when he first came up. He's really filled out, and he almost, in this photo, he almost looks like he's about 6'6". But you would know better, 6'3", 6'4". Let's talk about an absolute legendary figure in baseball, certainly with the Dodgers. Here's a great photo of you with Vin Scully 5 years ago, 2016. And I imagine that in your job when you were with the Dodgers, you pretty much talked to Vin every day, right?
Yeah, certainly my last 5 or 6 years when I was kind of an executive role. And I guess technically if someone was his boss, it was me. But Derek Hall used to always joke that Vin was the only person who could actually fire his own boss. If I ever caused problems, it was obviously not going to be the other way around. But I would go in most days into the booth and just check in on him, on Charlie Steiner, Rick Monday, and Jaime and Pepe, and just kind of one of your jobs is just to make sure that before they go on the air that they know what's going on that day in the organization. Is there anything that they kind of need to be aware of? And so I feel very, very lucky that this guy that my father grew up listening to, that I grew up listening to, he actually announced my son's birth on the air, which was one of the craziest, coolest things that's ever happened. I feel really, really fortunate to have gotten to spend so much time with him.
Was he the kind of person as a broadcaster that would come to you with questions, or did you usually approach him first?
Occasionally he would. I would say certainly by the time I was working with him, he had already been doing it for 50 plus years. So I'm sure in his earlier days, probably he had to rely much more heavily on the PR department. But one thing he did that was, he was so well prepared. He worked closely with the Dodgers team historian, but several others to really make sure that when he went on the air, he had a story about just about every guy on both teams. And he would tell you that part of what made him so unique is he would tell you stories about this person's mother was a teacher, or this person's father was a police officer, or he once got in trouble for stealing donuts in 3rd grade. And you're like, how does he get this stuff? And it's just, he just had a way of digging up fun and interesting information that I think you think about how hard it is to be a broadcaster to begin with and then do it by yourself in the booth. Because there's very few solo booths anymore. He would be in there for 9 innings straight by himself without an analyst, and just unbelievably kind, genuine human. We just exchanged messages recently about Gil Hodges, and he's obviously very, very excited that Gil was elected. That was kind of something he really wanted to see happen. And I'm just really happy to imagine him hearing that announcement on Sunday and the joy it probably brought him.
Yeah. I know it's early. Did Vin Scully give you any indication that he might come out for next year's induction?
I've not heard that. I mean, he's now in his close to mid-90s, so it's a pretty tough trip across the country. But I would imagine if he can, he's going to try to be here because this is just such a unique. He knew Gil Hodges when Gil was basically a rookie, and to essentially be able to be a part of that 70 years later is pretty special.
We're speaking with the Hall of Fame's new president, Josh Rawitch. Josh just took command of the Hall of Fame September 9th, the day after our induction ceremony, which featured, of course, Derek Jeter, Larry Walker, Ted Simmons, and the late Marvin Miller. We will take questions and comments for Josh a little bit later on, but let's continue talking, I guess, about maybe the lighter side of working for a baseball team, especially when you worked for the Los Angeles Dodgers, the close connection to Hollywood. I asked you who was the favorite celebrity that you've met along the way in baseball, non-baseball celebrity. I'm thinking Hollywood, big movie stars, TV stars, but you went in a different direction. You went musical, Dave Matthews.
I did. Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, I'm a big music fan, so I've been to a lot of Dave Matthews Band shows and just live music in general. I think Snoop Dogg and any number of amazingly cool musicians that came through. We got a chance to say hello to them for 2 minutes on the field, but it in particular, you're right. Being in LA, you get these just really unique people that pop in and out on a daily basis. And actually, it's funny. They used to do the Hollywood Stars game. I think they actually started it back up again. But one of my early jobs, when you were asking before about being an intern, one of my jobs was to basically be a clubhouse attendant for the celebrities in the Hollywood Stars game. So me and another guy would basically just get the celebrities whatever they needed. And there was a pretty funny story where Billy Crystal really did not take kindly to a joke that my colleague had made. And I think back to some of these funny examples of where Hollywood and baseball come together, or music and baseball come together. And I really do feel insanely lucky that you get a chance to just cross paths with some of the greatest people in sports, entertainment, politics. I've been fortunate enough to meet any number of really cool politicians, or sit in the Oval Office of the president of Mexico or president of the Dominican Republic, and you just kind of pinch yourself and wonder how you got there. And the answer is baseball.
Yeah. Now, did Dave Matthews play in any of these celebrity games?
He never did, but they did play Dodger Stadium one time. Probably, I don't know, early 2000s. They actually played the venue, which I thought was pretty neat. Just my world's kind of coming together, that music that I love so much is literally being piped out of the same speakers where they announce a player batting.
Yeah. Now, in recalling some of those Hollywood Stars celebrity matches, celebrity games, were there any Hollywood celebrities that were really good players that you could tell, yeah, these guys were athletes?
Yes, there were. I remember James Van Der Beek was pretty good. He was from Dawson's Creek, among some other shows. Oh man, there were definitely some pretty good players. I'm gonna have to try to remember who some of them were. Kevin James. Do you remember Kevin James from the King of Queens, among others?
Yeah.
I remember I want to say he had a walk-off inside the park grand slam one year, where he actually, and he's not a small guy, but he motored around the bases and I think he slid into home, I think on a grand slam. But I think that's what made that game so unique, certainly compared to the way the All-Star game does their celebrity softball game. This was actually baseball. It was hardball. And I remember about partway through my tenure, we contemplated making it softball because we wanted more people who maybe weren't as comfortable with a fastball coming in. And we got from a number of people. I remember Billy Crystal being one of them, saying, the reason I do this is because it's baseball. I don't want to play softball. You better not change it. And so I think we kept it at baseball for a long time. And I think they eventually did change it to softball. But these were people who absolutely loved playing growing up. And then they get a chance to live out their dream and stand at home plate at Dodger Stadium and play. It's pretty neat.
I just thought of one old Hollywood guy. I've got to ask you about it. I don't know if you met him, but I always thought he was brilliantly funny, even though he was very different in person than his comedic personality, which was very abrasive, very insulting. Talking about Don Rickles, he was a big baseball fan. He used to do stuff with Tommy Lasorda. You ever meet Don Rickles?
I did, yeah. He was a very good friend of Tommy Lasorda's, and so I mean, I had any number of interactions with Tommy over the years that involved some celebrity that he would bring around, and Don was one of them. I can't say I knew him well. I can kind of vividly remember a conversation. I should say vaguely, not vividly. Vaguely remember a conversation in Tommy's office where Don was there, but I don't remember a lot about him. I do know that he was hilarious, and Tommy. There is the story, I'm sure if you all look it up, where the time where Tommy sent Rickles to the mound during a game to make a pitching change, which obviously would never fly nowadays. But if you look it up, it really did happen. He actually put him in a uniform, sent him out there, and I think the pitcher looked at him and said, "What are you doing here?" So look, Google it, and you'll find a pretty good story for after this.
Wow. Rickles, of course, was the champion of insult humor. And he insulted everybody, no matter their background, whatever. But I've heard in person, he was completely opposite, one of the real nice guys in the industry. So you move on eventually from the Dodgers to the Diamondbacks. Here we have another great photo. Let's talk about, well, we've got Tony La Russa. We've got Luis Gonzalez in the middle, Randy Johnson on the far right. Tell us, Josh, what's the occasion? What's going on in this picture here?
Another international. It's funny that a lot of these happen to be international, but we actually, while I was at the Diamondbacks, we took a couple different goodwill tours to Japan, which were really just kind of media junkets. The first time I went, I think we brought Gonzo and Kevin Towers, our general manager, the late general manager, Kevin Towers. And then the second time was this group. It was the three of them, myself and our president and CEO, Derek Hall. So this was before Derek had even gotten there. We wound up landing, and this was, I think, in a restaurant in a train station where the three of us basically. And it's funny. I mean, they were all. It was like traveling with the Beatles. Certainly, when you're with Randy, everybody knows who he is because he's so tall. He stands out just by simply walking around. But we would walk through Tokyo, and we went to several different cities, and people were literally chasing these guys around Japan, wanting autographs, pictures, and it was really cool that they were willing to do it. And it's crazy now to think two Hall of Famers, and Gonzo, frankly, for my money, his numbers are off the charts, and he's truly my favorite player I've ever worked with. He was the Dodgers with me and Diamondbacks, and he's my favorite guy I ever worked with. This is one of my favorite photos from all of my time in baseball.
Now, some people might be wondering, why is Tony La Russa there? He did work in the front office of the Diamondbacks for a little bit of time. This was after retiring from the Cardinals, and obviously before coming back last year as manager of the White Sox. So he was one of the advisors, if you will, working in the front office, and he's actually got an official Diamondbacks jersey. Was Luis working in sort of an ambassador role for the team at that point?
Yeah, so Gonzo's basically been a special assistant or senior advisor to the president for about 15 years, and Randy does a similar sort of thing where it's much more it's less on field and more meeting with corporate partners and doing the sorts of kind of events sort of thing. Tony was really, truly our chief baseball officer, and basically he, along with Dave Stewart, who was the general manager, they were putting together the team for about 3 years. And this photo, now that I think about it, was literally right after we hired him, about 3 months before he got inducted. We came to his induction back in 2015. And this photo is, I think, about 3 weeks after that. It would have been August of 2015 that we all took this trip. And Tony had just been inducted into the Hall of Fame. Pretty cool.
I had a chance to interview Tony about 3 years ago. It was in our bullpen theater. And it was for a special program for some donors to the Hall of Fame. It was during Hall of Fame weekend. And I had a great time. I mean, his recall of details from regular season games in the early 1980s, he remembered sequences of, who batted, who got the next out, how the whole inning. I mean, I was stunned by his memory from, 35 years ago. It's incredible.
Yeah, he's still, I mean, I was very fortunate because during those years, because he was in the front office, I essentially sat with him and our president for most games in a suite together, and you would just hear, I mean, the way he thought about the game was just on another level. And I didn't want to like him when we hired him. I don't know why. I thought he'd be different than he was. He's probably got that sort of, if he's on your side, you love him, but if he's not, I mean, he's won more games than all but one person in the history of the game of baseball. It's unbelievable the knowledge that's in his head, and then to see him come back out of retirement in his mid-70s and lead another team to the postseason it's kind of crazy. It really is unbelievably impressive.
Josh, when you joined the Diamondbacks, was it a very different organization from the Dodgers? I'm not sure if your duties might have been similar, but was the organizational structure, was the atmosphere very different?
Yeah, I mean, the atmosphere certainly was, because when I was leaving the Dodgers, it was when the owners, Frank and Jamie McCourt, had gotten divorced. There had been a bankruptcy. And by that point, MLB had come in to take over the team because they weren't happy with the way it was being run. So I was there through all of that. And that was really, I mean, it wasn't the driving force behind me going to the Diamondbacks, but I think it's probably why Derek Hall, the president of the Diamondbacks, thought I might be willing to leave. And so he reached out knowing how hard it is to leave your childhood team to come to at the time, a 15-year-old franchise that, granted, they were winning. They were heading to the playoffs in 2011, and we kind of knew that. But what Derek, who came up through the O'Malley regime at the Dodgers, had created in Arizona was this incredible family-friendly atmosphere in the front office. And so that's really what, we talk a lot, and I'm sure the people at the Hall of Fame here have heard me talk a lot about the culture of an organization and making it a place where everybody wants to work and loves working. We have that here, but I learned a lot of that at the Diamondbacks, and that's really what I mean, the job was somewhat similar, but Derek just kept giving me more and more opportunities to grow while I was there, and ultimately put me in a position for this to come along.
Certainly one of the highlights of your time in Arizona, you received the Bob Fishel Award 2018. For those not familiar with Bob Fishel, this is a name that goes back to the 60s and I guess early 70s before he retired. Legendary public relations executive for the New York Yankees. There is this award that is given out every year to an outstanding Major League PR executive. This is like the Academy Award for somebody working in public relations, media information. When you found out you won the Bob Fishel Award, what'd you think?
Well, people who know me know that I'm not usually a quiet guy, but I remember I was driving at the ballpark near Chase Field. I was heading to lunch, and I got the call from MLB, and they told me that, and I remember being actually like speechless. I really didn't know what I should say, because it is. I think the coolest thing about that award is that it's voted on by the 30 teams' communications departments, and so it's the people that you work with every day at the other teams that ultimately decide who they think should be that award winner that year. So it meant the world to me. And as I got to know a little bit more about Bob, he was not still in baseball when I got into the industry. But every year I would go to the luncheon where they would talk about him and what he accomplished. And it really just to have my name. In fact, the plaque is literally like on the other side of that wall in the Hall of Fame here. And to have my name on that plaque with all those cool people was incredibly special to me.
You know, we had an executive here at the Hall of Fame who had a strong connection to Bob Fishel. Bill Guilfoyle was our vice president. He was the head of our media and communications for many, many years here in Cooperstown. Prior to that, worked for the Pirates. Before that, he was Bob Fishel's top lieutenant. He was the assistant to Bob Fishel in public relations, and would tell me stories about Bob and how dedicated he was, how professional, how he would just spend countless hours at the ballpark. When you win an award like this, I know that you knew about Fishel before, but does it motivate you to learn even more? You've won this award, you start researching his life a little bit more, find out exactly what he did.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I spent a lot of time, and you don't have a whole lot of time between when they tell you and when you actually then kind of give the speech at the winter meetings. But one thing I do remember, which was kind of crazy, was that his obituary ran in the paper on my birthday. When I went back to go read his obituary, it was from July 3rd. And I think I want to say it might have been my 21st birthday. I can't remember when it was, but it kind of, I read a lot about who he was as a human and what he meant to the game. And so anytime I get to meet people who knew him, I do ask them questions. What do they remember about him and what made him so special? And he really dedicated his life to the game. That's in a lot of ways what you find of people in this sport, because it is 162 games and it's nonstop, 24/7, 365. People truly give their life to this game. And he did. He really, that was the mark he left, and it's been carried on for a long time.
Absolutely. Let's get to some more recent events. Well, really the most recent news in terms of our election that took place just a few days ago, Sunday, December 5th. You were in Orlando for the 2 era committee votes that took place. You were there when the committees met. Tell us, what exactly was your role that day?
Honestly, on that day, it's really more almost administrative in terms of making sure that the room is what it needs to be, and that if there are questions people have throughout the process, I'm not giving any opinions. I'm not giving any information. I'm really there to answer specific questions that they may have. So some people may be familiar with John Shestakovsky, our VP of Communications and Education. He and his group really kind of put together this incredible binder. I think I have one right here behind me, but all this information that the voters get, from biography, statistics, the rules, how you're allowed to, basically the process that you're about to go through. And so a lot of the 16 people who come into the room have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen before they go in there. But for some of them, it's the first time. And so really, I got the chance to mostly be a fly on the wall. I really didn't have to speak up much in those meetings. And then ultimately, I think for those that may have watched, at that point, I'm kind of taking notes if there's something that was said that might be good to come out on the air that night on MLB Network. I was the one that got to actually announce the results on MLB Network. Jane Forbes Clark, our chairman, was the person that actually calls the family and lets either the family, or in the case of Oliva and Cott, know that they have been elected. But then she put me on the phone with each of them, and you really just, it's this overwhelming feeling of people crying and cheering and laughing, and they've waited so long. It really was just an incredibly special day and an event to be a part of.
So you're in those meetings. I could try to pry out from you some of the information, some of the things that were said, but you're kind of sworn to secrecy. You're not really in a position to tell us what happened. But
Nope.
I imagine, even though you're not saying much and you're just there in an observational manner, it's got to be almost like watching a ball game. It's, nerve-wracking to think who's going to get in, who's not going to get in, whose arguments are going to stand the test of the day. It must have been a great thrill.
There's no question. And we were lucky that this was one of the rare years where we had 2 committees. So we had a morning where we went over the Golden Days era committee, and then we took a break for lunch and came back and we did the early baseball one. And just, I guess the best thing I can say is that I know that there are people who have strong opinions one way or another, whether someone got in and shouldn't, or didn't get in and should, or got in and should, didn't get in and shouldn't. There's all these strong opinions. And I think the best thing is that you really have this incredibly intelligent group of people that's made up of Hall of Famers, of executives, of historians. Everybody of the 10-person ballot on each committee's got a very, each person was discussed at length, and pros and cons and all the things that it just, you can rest assured that they are given their chance to be reviewed. Mm-hmm. And that's really ultimately one of the things that I'm there to help remind people, is that our job, their job, the voters' job, is not to try to elect somebody to the Hall of Fame. Their job is to make sure nobody fell between the cracks. That's really what we want to make sure happens in that environment, where they get kind of a review by the era committee.
Now, later in the day, I understand you had a chance to talk to both Jim Cott and Tony Oliva. They're, of course, the 2 living out of this group of 6 new Hall of Famers. Tell us about that experience.
It was pretty neat. Jim Cott, obviously, I've known of for a long time. And I remember him being one of my earliest baseball cards. So I think that was actually kind of a cool full circle moment. But he was so, I think when you compare the way each person was, you had the Hodges family was literally in tears on the phone. And you've got various others where they're screaming in the background when the phone rang. Jim I only could hear him, and he was very subdued, but you could tell how touched he was. He was so humble and immediately started talking about his father and his father being a huge fan of the Hall of Fame and going to an induction ceremony in the 1950s for his favorite player. So that kind of just gave me the chills. And then with Tony, it was I was very lucky when I started at the Dodgers. I got the advice that if I wanted to work in baseball, I should learn Spanish. So I went back and really took Spanish seriously, studied abroad, learned the language, and I speak it pretty decently for a non-native speaker. And so being able to hop on with Tony and really talk to him in his native tongue and explain to him how proud we were of him and how excited we were for him, you could just tell he appreciated being able to have that conversation in Spanish. And I think that's probably what I'll take out of that one, was just you could hear the joy in his voice.
Well, he must have been thrilled that you could do that.
Yeah, it's and I ultimately wound up using some of it on the broadcast, mainly just because you think about whether this is going to be reshown down in Cuba where he and Minnie Minoso were born, or the Dominican, or Venezuela, Puerto Rico, Mexico. It's a global game for a reason, and ultimately we're a global hall where people think of us all over the world. And so if we have that opportunity to spread our message in multiple languages, we're going to do it. I just got to keep working on some of my other language skills. I've only got 2 at the moment.
Yeah. Did you ever have a chance in the past to meet either Buck O'Neil or Minnie Minoso?
I didn't, unfortunately. Buck, what's funny, I don't know if you can see it on the wall behind me. There's a home plate that's there that is it's actually Roland Hemond, who won the Buck O'Neil Award. So it's an image of Roland and Buck O'Neil that I've had in my office for a long time because I'm very close with Roland. But I've always had great respect for Buck O'Neil, going back to my first visit to the Negro Leagues Museum, and even before that, seeing him in the baseball documentary. But what's funny is I was cleaning out my house to move out here to Cooperstown, and I found my old actual Rolodex from the Dodgers, like the actual one you used to flip through a Rolodex, and I had a card that had Buck O'Neil's number on it. So at some point, probably in the late 90s, I would have had a reason to call him, and I taped it to the back of the thing on my wall there, and I think it may just be the number of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, but it's still pretty cool that somewhere along the way I had some reason to interact with him.
That's great. Minoso, did you ever cross paths with him?
We didn't, though. What's funny is there are some players that I just remember my father talking about, and I remember him talking about him. The strange thing with Minnie Minoso is I think a lot of people have said that he may have had his candidacy hindered by the fact that he played for a game in 1976 and a game in 1980, which helped him get in to be a part of 5 decades. In a weird way, that's kind of what I remembered him when I was a kid growing up in the 80s. He was the guy that played in 5 decades. He wasn't this legendary player from the 50s, 60s that I didn't really understand how good he was until way later when I started really studying the history of it.
Yeah, actually picked up a hit at the age of 54, which is remarkable. One final question on the ERA committee. Do we know yet who will be accepting for the 4 deceased electees, or is that simply too early in the process?
No, we don't. We've been talking to the families and we're trying to sort through it, but unfortunately, I don't have that for you.
Okay. Well, we look forward to finding that out in the coming weeks and months. Let's have a little bit of fun with some of these other photographs. When you first sent me this one, I thought I was looking at one of the new kids on the block, but this is you from the year 2000. You look incredibly young. It's only 20 years ago, but I guess you were in your 20s at that time. So this was your first visit to Cooperstown. You were at Doubleday Field. What brought you here? Was it work related or vacation?
No, I was actually in New York City. My niece was born, and so we kind of had a half day or a day to kill. My father and I drove up to Cooperstown. We got to go to that's obviously the dugout at Doubleday, but then we walked around the museum, and I remember thinking how incredibly cool this place was. I feel like my hair was not that bleached blonde. I feel like that has to be like a reflection somehow, but that shirt is pretty awful. Anyway, that trip was, again, you think back to telling that kid that someday you're going to be in this job. It's almost impossible to think that could have happened. But I feel very lucky to be living here, and that dugout, and thinking about it now, that dugout will probably wind up being where my son plays his high school baseball games. That's unfathomable. That's a really crazy, cool thing.
That's great. Another shot is inside the museum. This is up on the second floor, I believe, in the Sacred Ground exhibit, and you're looking at the Ebbets Field cornerstone.
Indeed, and I do have the baggy pants going there. So, yeah, Dodger fan during those days. I remember taking pictures of Jackie Robinson's plaque and Sandy Koufax's plaque, and really just kind of all these people that I grew up knowing and loving. It's pretty cool.
Now, a more recent photograph of you after you've taken over officially as our president. This was something, of course, that came down just this past year. Tim Meade announcing that he would be leaving back in April. And then I guess a few weeks after that, it was announced that you would be coming on, and you officially did start in early September. How did this all come about? Did you submit a resume? Did the Hall contact you? Tell us a little bit about the process.
It kind of started with Jeff Idelson, who was Tim's predecessor, and then he came back during the kind of 4-month span from April to September. Jeff actually reached out to me and said, I think you'd be the kind of perfect fit for this sort of job, given your background, both with business and baseball, and having all the contacts that you really need in this industry to make this job work. So it started with that. And then ultimately, obviously, a lot of conversations with my wife about making a move this big. And then an incredibly interesting and unique interview process where the search committee was headed up by Jane Forbes Clark. But among the people that I met with were Cal Ripken Jr., Commissioner of Baseball Rob Manfred, Harvey Schiller, one of the titans of the sports industry. I mean, to talk to those people to make a decision on my career, it's pretty, I'd say, intimidating, but thankfully they didn't make it intimidating. It just felt like I was getting to know them and they were getting to know me, and it landed me here in Cooperstown.
When you got the news, and I'm assuming it was in person, that you had received the job, what went through your mind?
It actually wasn't. I was still in Arizona, and Jane had called, and it was very quickly into the conversation. She asked how I was doing. I said I was good, and she said, "Well, I just want you to know I just spoke to the rest of the search committee, and we'd like to make you the 8th president of the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum." And I can remember those. I remember saying to her, "I wish you could see how big the smile was on my face right now." So I'll probably never forget that moment, but I kind of walked out of there and walked into the president's office, who was right next door to me, Derek. And I was like, "Wow, it happened. That's pretty crazy." Yeah. And then I called my wife, and just an amazing day.
I know it's been only a few months on the job, but are there any similarities at all between working for a major league team and being the president of the Hall of Fame?
I mean, I'd say the biggest similarity is honestly just a passion for what you're doing, a passion for the brand that you work for. That isn't necessarily always the case at a widget making company or wherever a lot of people work. People love what they do. I just feel very, very lucky that the staff here has welcomed me with such open arms, yourself included, that people genuinely this isn't just a job. They care deeply about this place. And there's 100 people who work here, 90 something full-time, and then a large number of part-time and volunteers who really just, they get to work in baseball heaven. So I think that's been probably one of the biggest similarities. And then of course it's a business. So it has everything like admissions and corporate partnerships and merchandise and public relations and a nonprofit arm, just like any of the teams do. And that's probably, I'd say, the biggest similarity. And of course, the biggest difference is that there are most teams don't have the museum side of things. So I'm learning a lot about the museum industry, what a huge part of our business that is, and really just basically trying. I mean, every single day I go into the museum. I have a little alert that goes off on my phone at 3:00 to remind me to go spend about 10 minutes looking at some exhibit, some plaque, something inside there that I don't know, so that I can just keep learning something new every day.
Yeah. Certainly these first few months, it's an opportunity to learn the job, to see what you're going to be facing on a day-to-day basis. Your first full year will be coming up in 2022. Along those lines, any plans that you would like to tell us about, that short-term goals, vision for the Hall of Fame as we start getting ready for what we hope is eventually a pandemic-free year, 2022?
Well, you just nailed it. I mean, a lot of my first 3 months, I just passed the 90-day mark, and a lot of my goals for that was listening and learning and understanding kind of what priorities are and where do we need to put our efforts and focus and connecting with people who have ideas. So a lot of it has been trying to take in that info, and I clearly don't have all the answers after 30 days, after 3 months, and I won't have all the answers at any point. But I'd say the biggest things that we've talked a lot about is just continuing to stay relevant, make sure that for the next generation of fans, the next kid that looks like a new kid on the block that comes in, hopefully they're still having the same experience, and that someone like my son or my daughter that comes in, they still have this incredible experience of coming to the Hall of Fame. So for us, it's really about staying relevant. It is very much about the comeback from the pandemic. And obviously I know this variant has kind of thrown some things up in the air a little bit more than we would have liked, but all the things like induction weekend and Hall of Fame Classic that we're expecting to come back that people know and love, that's a big part of what we're going to do. And then there's actually a good number of new things that we have not yet rolled out to the staff. We'll probably start to put those things together here in the next maybe month. And when we get back after the break, we'll get a chance to lay out kind of new ideas and some fresh announcements for 22. And so I'll hold off on telling the public till we obviously get to talk to our staff here about the ideas that we have. But a lot of them have come from that group. A lot of what we're planning has come from things that people have suggested over the last several years, and we now finally feel like we're in a good place to hopefully execute on those.
As we get set to wrap up the program, and I'm going a couple extra minutes here because I think it's important and some great stuff that we've been able to touch with you. First question comes in from, I'm not going to say who it is. He simply wants to know, what role did your father play in your career?
Well, I guess I can say that he unbelievably critical role in my love of baseball, and in really instilling very good values in us. For myself, my brother, my sister, we was never really about money or really trying to get material things. It was about doing the right thing, being a good person. And ultimately, I think the work ethic probably is the biggest thing. I learned a lot of my work ethic from my father, and I often tell people who want to get into sports, it's not usually the smartest person who succeeds in the world of sports. It's often comes down to work ethic. And I think a lot of that stems from advice that he would have given me very early on.
We have a question that I might be able to answer, and if not me, I think Josh probably could. Someone was wondering about Tommy John, who of course was a great pitcher, also was a surgery pioneer, Tommy John surgery. And this person wanted to know when Tommy will next have a chance to be elected. If I'm not mistaken, his candidacy comes up in, I think it's 2 years, 2023. And I believe that is for the modern era ballot. Tommy John would be potentially on that ballot. Luis Tiant would be another candidate as well. And then one final question having nothing to do with the Hall of Fame, but a little bit of a connection to your former team, Josh, the Dodgers. This is from Steve. Having grown up as a Dodger fan, what are your thoughts about the possibility of the National League adopting the DH?
It's hard because I grew up without it. I really grew up a National League person. And so I love all of the great things that go into the strategy of it. But I also think, generally speaking, I do agree when people say nobody came to watch somebody who's not the best in the world do what they're doing. And you wind up, whatever it is, 9 times out of 10, the pitcher just either strikes out on it. To me, that's not the best part of our game. So I would have no issue if if baseball decided to put a designated hitter in the National League. I'd have no problem with that. Every once in a while, I know Zach Greinke would have an issue. Madison Bumgarner would have an issue. Plenty of conversations with those guys over the years about their love of hitting, but it's not quite the same as it was where guys like Don Drysdale were hitting 7, 8, 9 homers a year. It's just at this point, I think it's perfectly fine with me if they put it in both leagues.
Final question for Josh Rawitch. You talked a little bit about what's been going on these first few months. Is there any one particular aspect of the job or maybe an aspect of Cooperstown that you found to be a little surprising, something you didn't expect?
I'd say the biggest thing that I would say surprised me is how many people are involved, not just from Cooperstown. I mean, the person we're buying a house next week and the person who's working on our loan also happens to, in his spare time, work on induction weekend. And we don't have an events department. We're this little nonprofit in central New York, and yet we're one of the bigger global sports brands that there are. And so I've been blown away by how many people just take a second job on during the summertime. The transportation is run by Cassidy and the library, or hospitality. You've got Jen from the mailroom. You've just got all these people that are helping do things that are not part of their job, but they do it because they love this place. And it's a pretty special place to come to work every day. I think a lot of people are surprised when they hear that we are not an MLB entity. We're this nonprofit that operates on membership and donations and things of that nature. And so hopefully for anybody watching, if you're not yet a member, you'll become one. And if you come and visit, let us know. I'd love to come out, and you can say you watched this, and I will make it a point to come out. If you made it all the way through this, an hour and 7 minutes of me talking, I will make it a point to come out and say hello when you're here.
Well, the hour and 7 minutes, it flew by for me. I hope it flew by for you as well, Josh. Very enjoyable. We thank you for joining us today. It's given us a great insight into what your vision for the Hall of Fame is, both now and in the future. We thank you, Josh.
My pleasure, Bruce. Thanks for doing it.
Our thanks to Josh Rawitch, new president of the Hall of Fame, also to the Ford Motor Company, our primary sponsor. We hope you all enjoyed our program today with our new Hall of Fame president. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.